I'm Roy from Roy's Garage. Today I'm going to be working on a 2002 Toyota 4Runner 3.4 liter automatic. I'm going to show you how to replace the valve cover gaskets, spark plugs, and spark plug wires. These are the tools I'm going to be using today to do this job. A door panel remover, cotter pin puller, long nose plier, a standard plier, 3/8 ratchet, 3/8 extension, another 3/8 extension, 5/8 spark plug socket, 14mm socket, two different length 12mm socket, two different length 10mm socket, 1/4 inch ratchet, 1/4 inch extension, another 1/4 inch extension, 10mm flex socket, 10mm socket, 14mm wrench, 12mm wrench, 10mm wrench, 14mm wrench with a swivel socket, flat tip screwdriver, and another flat tip screwdriver, brake clean, spray adhesive, anti-seize, silicone spray, dielectric grease, and some silicone. These are the parts I'm going to be using today to do this job. A valve cover gasket kit. These are the grommets for the valve cover. Spark plug wire set I bought from the dealer. Cam plugs. Upper intake gasket. Spark plugs. Pcv Valve Grommet and a Pcv valve. Okay, so in order to get access to the valve covers, I'm going to have to remove the intake manifold and the air intake tube. Okay, first we're going to be removing the air intake tube. Removing this hose. Removing this guy. Removing this mount for the wire. We're going to be removing this upper intake. So there's an electrical connector back here. Remove that. So going to be removing these two coolant hoses. Remove this PCV valve hose. So I'm going to be removing the throttle cable, removing the mount. So we're going to be removing this connector. Removing this ground strap. Removing this bracket. Removing this hose. There's a bracket. We're going to have to remove this bracket. One side is attached to the manifold. The other side is going to be attached to the engine block. There's a bolt on the bottom that attaches the bracket to the block. We're going to have to remove that. So removing these two screws. So I'm going to be removing this upper portion of the intake. So there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bolts we got to remove, then the intake should come off. Okay, so I'm going to be removing 5 bolts to remove this lower portion of the manifold. So it's going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so remove this vacuum hose. Now we should be able to take out the intake. Make one more bolt back here. Okay, there's another mount back here. We're gonna have to remove it. So I'm gonna be removing this gasket. Now with some paper towel, I'm gonna be plugging up these holes. I don't want nothing falling in these holes. So I'm gonna be removing the coil packs. So now we're going to be removing the valve cover. Okay, so now we can remove the valve cover. So with a screwdriver, kind of wedge it in and pry it up. Okay, so I'm gonna be replacing, there's a cam plug back here. In order to replace that, there's a metal plate back here that's held on with 2 bolts. I gotta remove that plate. And then this last cap right here is held on with 2 bolts. I gotta remove the cap and then the cam plug comes out. So I'm gonna be removing the 2 bolts. You can't see it, but you just gotta go by feel. Okay, so I removed the plate. I'm going to be removing these two bolts. Okay, with my screwdriver, I'm going to be prying off this guy. And then removing the plug. So there's two half moon cam plugs, one here and one here. So I'm going to be removing it because I'm going to reseal it. So I'm going to be removing the old gasket, removing the old spark plug tube seals. So I'm going to be replacing the Pcv valve and grommet. This guy is just really brittle. If you break it, it's okay because we're going to be putting a new one on. Shooting some brake clean. So I'm going to be removing the old grommets and putting on new grommets. I'm going to be putting on my new tube seals. Put some white grease. That way it might slide in a little easier. Just put some white grease right on the inside so it slides over the spark plug tube. So I'm going to be putting on my gasket, but first I'm going to be using this contact spray. You can use this, you can use gasket singe, whatever you want to use, anything to stick it on. And let it dry a little while and then put it on. So I'm going to be putting on the gasket. Okay, so I'm going to be putting on my Pcv Valve Grommet first. Shooting some silicone spray on so it goes in easier. So we're going to be cleaning the engine side with some brake clean. Make sure you get all of that oil and old silicone. Get them all off. Sometimes you might have to use a screwdriver or something to scrape off the old silicone. But make sure it's all clean before you start assembling it. Cleaning up the cap. Clean the half moon plugs. Make sure you get all that oil and silicone off. Okay, so I'm going to be putting silicone on the half moon cam plug, just fill it up. So I'm going to be putting some silicone around my cam plug. So we're going to be putting the plug back in. We're going to be putting the cap on. Putting the bolts on. And tightening it up. So I'm going to be putting on this plate that goes behind the cam plug. Tightening up the plate. So I'm going to be dabbing some silicone right on the ends of the half moon plug and right where the cap meets the head, put a little silicone. Right where the cap meets the head. So carefully put the cover on. We're going to be putting on the new grommets on the valve cover bolts. So we're putting the bolts on. Bolting up the harness. Connecting all the mount. Okay, so now we're going to change the spark plugs. So I'm going to be removing the spark plug. So I'm going to put some dielectric on my plug. Stick it in the socket. Put some anti-seize on my thread. And screw it in and tightening it up. Okay, so I'm going to be putting on my coils. So I'm going to put some dielectric grease right in here. So putting the coils on. So I'm going to be bolting up the coil pack, putting some anti-seize on my bolt. Connecting my coil pack, putting some dielectric grease right in this connector. Okay, so now we're going to be removing the driver's side valve cover. Pull these spark plug wires out. So I'm going to be removing the valve cover bolts. Okay, we're gonna be removing this hose. So with a screwdriver, I'm gonna be opening the cover. So remove the oil filler cap. So remove the wires from the injector. Press the tab and pull it out. Okay, so I'm going to be removing the old gasket and cleaning up the valve cover and replacing the spark plug 2 seals, just like the right side. So we're going to be prying out these seals. Sometimes if you cannot pry them out, then you got to hammer them out. So I'm going to be putting on my tube seals using some white grease. Okay, put a little bit white grease on the inside of the seal. So you got to remove these old grommets. There's a metal plate behind the cam plug held on with 2 bolts. We're going to be removing the metal plate, same as the other side. So I'm going to be removing this cap right here. Removing the cam plug. So I'm going to be removing this half moon cam plug. And there's one more in the front. Cleaning the plug with some brake clean. Removing the old silicone off these plugs. Cleaning up the cap. Make sure there's no oil on it. So we're going to be cleaning up the engine side. So I'm going to put on my gasket onto my valve cover, but first I'm going to be using some contact cement. I'm going to be spraying the valve cover and then spraying the gasket. I'm going to glue the gasket onto the valve cover. So I'm going to be putting on my gasket. So I'm going to be putting some silicone around my half cam plug and putting it on. This one goes on the front. So I'm going to be putting some silicone around my cam plug. So installing the plug. Putting a little silicone on this cap right here. Installing the cap. So tighten up the cap. Putting on the plate. Putting some silicone right here. So now we're going to be installing the cover. I'm going to be putting on these bolts. Already I put the new grommets on the bolt. Tightening up the bolts. Putting on these connectors to my fuel injection. Putting some dielectric grease right in that connector. Putting on my oil filler cap. So I'm going to be replacing the spark plugs. Putting some dielectric grease on the porcelain part of the plug. Putting some anti-seize on my thread. Screw it in and tightening it up. So I'm going to be replacing the spark plug wires. Putting some dielectric grease right into these wires. Removing this spark plug wire from the coil, you gotta lift this tab up and then pull this wire out. So don't forget to put this hose on. So I'm gonna be removing these napkins, cleaning up my intake. Putting on a new gasket. Put a little anti-seize on this stud. Okay, putting on my intake. So I'm going to be bolting up the lower intake. Putting on this hose. Bolting up this mount to the intake. Okay, cleaning up my intake. Okay, putting on my gasket. Some anti-seize on this stud. Putting the upper intake on. Make sure there's nothing in the way. Putting some anti-seize on my bolts. So I'm going to be mounting these guys right now. Putting the ground wire on. Putting this mount on. I'm going to be putting this bracket on. Putting on this vacuum hose. So we're going to be putting on these hoses. There's some electrical wires you got to put on. Put some dielectric grease in these connectors. Some more dielectric grease. So I'm going to be putting on my throttle cable. Okay, mounting this cable and this vacuum hose. Putting some silicone spray on my air intake tube. Make it a little easier to slide on. Put some on that, put some on that. Putting this guy on. Okay, so I'm going to start up the vehicle. I just run them for about 10-15 minutes and make sure there's no leaks. So I ran this vehicle for about 15 minutes. And I was looking around, making sure there's no leaks. And everything looks dry. Everything looks really good. So that's how you replace a valve cover gaskets, spark plugs, and spark plug wires. If you have any questions, comment below. Make sure to subscribe. Give me a thumbs up, and I see you in the next video. Aloha.